Monitoring and maintaining compliance is a never-ending struggle with a high price of failure. Firemon helps customers meet complex and varying compliance requirements. Firemon has fully customizable reporting, analytics, assessments, and dashboards to meet the compliance needs of any organization. With Firemon, compliance reports take a tenth of the time, and real-time continuous compliance eliminates the anxiety and headaches of audit preparation. Improve security outcomes by improving security operations with Firemon. Visit securityweekly.com/Firemon to learn more. Cybercriminals are working overtime. Last year in the fourth quarter alone, phishing attacks disguised as COVID testing information increased by 521%. Barracuda has identified 13 types of email threats and how cybercriminals use them to steal money from your company or personal information from your employees and customers. Find out about the 13 email threat types and how Barracuda can provide complete email protection for your teams, your customers, and your reputation. Get your free ebook at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. That's securityweekly.com/Barracuda. It's time to rethink how we approach cybersecurity because the reality is modern cyber attackers are already past your initial defenses. ExtraHop helps your security team find and eradicate advanced threats before real damage is done. Protect your enterprise and customers with better defense. Learn more about how ExtraHop stops advanced threats at securityweekly.com/ExtraHop. That's extra HOP.
The Business Security Weekly. I am your host, Matt Alderman, joined by Ben Carr and Tyler Robinson. Don't miss any of your favorite Security Weekly content. Visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to any of our podcast feed and have all new episodes downloaded right to your phone. You can also join our mailing list, Discord server, and follow us on social media and our streaming platforms. Join Alan Stasilowskis and host Tyler Robinson and Paul Asadorian on April 21st to learn how to gain visibility into your enterprise with Sysmon. Also, join Paul Asadorian and Rich Mogul on May 4th to learn how to choose the right architecture for your application. Live attendees at both of these webcasts will have the chance to win a $100 Hacker Warehouse gift card. Register at securityweekly.com/webcasts. And don't forget to check out our library of on-demand webcasts and technical trainings by visiting securityweekly.com/on-demand. All right, gentlemen, time for the weekly articles. Now, articles were a little light last week. It was kind of an extended holiday weekend. We had Passover and Easter, and not a ton of articles came out. I was scraping the barrel a little bit to find a couple. But this first article from Gartner, the headline caught my attention. Cybersecurity, we need to talk. It's an interesting opening line statement around, hey guys, what are we doing in the space? Like, here's some guidance. And Ben, I don't know if you use Gartner or not for some of your research and data, but there's a couple really interesting points they highlight in this article around technology and investments and some other things. I was curious how it resonated with you.
Yeah, it was interesting reading through the article. I guess, a lot of these are, cyber insurance eligibility. I mean, we've talked about that a bit, right? Business operations, regulatory demands. I mean, I think a lot of this is kind of commonplace stuff. I have used Gartner in the past. I'm not really using them right now. I guess it's, look, everybody needs to have a wake-up call that this is a top-level risk. And again, I think, it's funny, like, it seems like recurring themes. We talk about these same things. So I don't think any of this should have been a shock to anybody. I think, thinking about the Ukraine and whether there's impact to supply chain, obviously that's something that's a newer event. But most of this is pretty typical. I didn't see a ton of stuff, but I mean, I think there is a wake up at the board level and at the E-staff level that if this is one of the top risks on your matrix, then you really should be trying to figure out how to address it.
Yeah, I like the first bullet when it breaks down. It says organizations must stop investing in security tools and start investing in outcomes. Think about that for a second. Like, now vendors would be like, no, keep spending money on my tools, but right. But I mean, in reality, if this is about risk and a business risk, then think about the outcomes you want to achieve and then work back to identify which investments you need to make, right? Where I'm not sure everybody thinks that way. They think about, wait, I got to make a bunch of security investments before I know my risks and outcomes I'm trying to achieve.
It's a backward process, though, right? I mean, like ultimately, I think what people need to think about is what capabilities are you investing in? Don't make the mistake of then transitioning a capability into a tool. A capability is, the ability to actually address an issue that you have, right? And that should always start with people, followed by process, and at the very end, what's the technology that enables all that stuff to happen? But how many times have, I think, my peers or, people that I've worked with, I've talked to them and they've started out with, well, let's go get a tool and then figure out how to map it into the process. Just a horrible approach.
Right. Yeah, we were talking at the end of the last week. At the end, there was some interesting dialogue about some technology choices, but that's because Jason went through a very specific process to evaluate capabilities he needed to meet outcomes, right? To the point is once he knows what he wants, then they can go out and evaluate technologies. And he made some interesting, his team ended up making some interesting choices. We're not going to talk about what they chose, but it was the right approach because they knew what they needed to achieve an outcome, then chose the tool, not the other way around.
Yeah, and I think, if you've been in the game long enough and you've done this and you've stayed current with technology, as you shift from one job to another job, it may look to outsiders that sometimes the CISO or, a director or manager is picking a tool, but they've already done the evaluation of, what is the capability I need? And they've maybe, looked at a bunch of different tools to figure out, all right, this is the best one that's purpose fit for what I want to do. But at the end of the day, I think you still need to look at that in terms of what the resources are in your current role and make sure that you can actually implement that capability effectively. Because again, if you start out with the tool and just try to slap it in and think you're going to get value out of it, I think that's, we mentioned shelfware earlier. I think Tim said, last thing I want is shelfware. I think you end up with a lot of shelfware because the expectations are what the vendors say it can do. But have you matched that up with your ability to deliver that capability internally in your organization?
That talent to tool matching and the capability and talent grooming also plays a big role in how you actually deliver on that strategy. And I think that's probably one of the biggest benefits and outcomes of not getting shelfware is by identifying what your real capability is and being very honest with either bringing in additional resources, training the current resources, or evaluating the talent that you have and then matching the capability and tool set to that group. That makes a big difference.
Yeah, it ties a little bit into this next article, the 10 signs of a strong security leader. Now, these are not security specific, by the way. These are just 10 signs, in my opinion, of a strong leader in general. But when you apply it to security, you start to think about what Tyler just said. People process, having well-documented processes, and understanding some of your skill sets and your talent, right, play into strong leadership identity, but also back to the previous article around making the right investments for outcomes. I was not shocked by any of the 10 really on this list, but there are some that I think are really important for people to understand, which is, be pretty open and transparent. Answer any question directly, right? Just certain things that that if you're getting straight answers and people are answering questions, they're not deferring and they're being proactive and making timely decisions, you're in the right place. Like you just kind of know it. And it's a good environment to be in. When you don't see those things, that's when you create a lot of internal angst and it's not good for an organization.
Yeah, man, I echo the thoughts. Like when you said that these aren't just good security leaders, right? These are leaders in general. And that's what I thought. Like when I read this, there was nothing that stood out to me as like, it doesn't apply to something else. I mean, I think these are just good traits to have as a leader. But I think the other thing to look at is as you're grooming your team and building your team, like look for these traits in the people that are in your team or how you incentivize these traits. And I'm a big believer in that. you get what you actually incentivize out. And so, to turn this into something from a security perspective, everybody expects vulnerabilities to be remediated. But at the end of the day, from an operational side, if you're not, putting in your MBOs and your KPIs, things for those operational leaders to then make sure that they're patching and fixing and remediating, you'll always have a disconnect. So incentivize the behavior you want to get at the end of the day. And so I think if you look at these traits and you look for things that you say, what do I want to incentivize? I mean, make sure that you're not letting things go through where they're not well documented. Make sure that you're actually highlighting, when people's actions don't match what they're articulating. Make sure that you're actually nurturing and promoting talent yourself, so your people see that, and you will nurture and promote talent within their lower level of the organization. I think that's really the key, is to make sure that you're aligning this to the goals and the strategies that will ensure long-term success for your org and for the company.
Yeah, and KPIs get interesting in goal alignment. This is a thing we've been working on more internally this year, because I'm a big believer in identifying those right KPIs and then making sure that they're in the individual goals. So you bring up a really good point. If there is a disconnect there, that is a leadership gap, right?
It is.
You've got to have goals aligned for the employees and the employee base to meet the key performance indicators you want to measure the business on. And it's not always that easy, Ben. I think the challenge for some organizations is, which one, do you have the right set of KPIs, leading and lagging indicators that are helping you drive the business? And it sounds easy, but it's actually a little harder than that to actually do, to make sure that you're setting the right goal alignment for your employees. Then you see that alignment. Then things are in much better shape.
Yeah, and that's why I think people shouldn't look at KPIs as static. They should look at KPIs as something that's a target state. But if you realize it's off, you need to think about potentially resetting those to align to what you can actually deliver on. And I think KPIs should be something, and your MBOs should be something that you're saying, okay, this is what I think, that it may be a stretch. It may be not easy to get to, but it's attainable, right? Given a set of circumstances. If you make it too difficult or too easy, then those goals become somewhat useless, right? I mean, you're trying to, again, incentivize that directional behavior to move your team and the company in the direction you want to achieve. So if that direction isn't achievable, it's unlikely that you're going to get people really committed to that goal without being disheartened and disengaged at some point.
I'll give you a really good example, because I have one. If you want to grow your audience for the podcast, for example, I wonder why that would matter. Then one of the goals could be to get bigger name guests and talent on to interview on the shows, because that would create interest across the audience to drive more stuff. See, that's a very logical goal alignment to a potential KPI around audience growth, right? So to your point, you didn't make it too hard, but you didn't make it too easy, because it's not easy to go out and find these larger names to agree to come on to the podcast, for example. But we are stretching the limits of who traditionally would come on. So I mean, these are real life examples, because these are things we talk about all the time internally.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point.
Yeah. Is your organization ripe for a reorg? Oh, sorry, Tyler. I skipped you.
No, you're good. My internet had a little delay here, but I was going to say that kind of ties into your next story, though, with the reorg and what KPIs and capabilities you have internally to match or meet those stretch goals. I don't think stretch goals should be something that you should not attempt to attain or strive towards, but sometimes you have to think outside of your organization and think about the strategic alignment of who you need to get in order to reach one of those larger stretch goals. And that means bringing on talent, bringing on capability, and having the right people in place to do that. And sometimes that is a reorg.
Right. Yeah, it is potentially. I'm curious, Ben, from your perspective, like you just got to a new organizational structure.
Sure.
I mean, did you do a reorg, or like how do you approach an organizational structure when you go on? I'll share my story in a minute, but I'm curious from your perspective, like when you go into a new organization, how much are you thinking reorg, or are you thinking let things kind of stay static in the near term?
Yeah, so that's a complicated question. I think any CISO or any C-level exec, or when you go into a new organization, one of your thoughts are, I have to see what this looks like and see if it's is the reason why it may be underperforming, if it was underperforming at the time, is the reason the people, is it the process, is it the leadership that was there, and all those things are really viable answers, right? So I think my approach is typically, and what I approach it here is, come in and understand the org and understand the team and understand if I have the right talent. And it may be, and I like to think about a reorg a little bit more generically, maybe. It may be that the reorg is just moving people around, right? Or giving people additional challenges or opportunities. So I think a lot of people get kind of complacent in their role. And so that, can breed a lack of interest. And so once you start seeing that, I think, maybe it's time to shift. Maybe it's time to move your SecOps person to attack surface, or your GRC person over to, some other role, and shifting those roles around, or certainly from an IC side, giving those individual contributors different opportunities within the org can really invigorate it. Now, sometimes you do have to go in and say, all right, this isn't fit for purpose, or I have a build here. I've got open holes or open gaps where, as we grow, as we transform the business, that we have openings and we need to kind of stretch or change the org. But I don't like to go in and say, I'm coming in, I'm going to change everything, because that's not really giving the current org the due diligence to understand what's actually broken. And I think a lot of people who come in and have that attitude find that, 6 months, 12 months later, they're in the same situation. It's still not working, but that's because they're not building correctly.
Right. Tyler, any thoughts on this one? I have one story to share.
Go ahead.
So, as most people know, when we got acquired a year and a half ago, I was trying to figure out what happens, right? And so when you get acquired, and think about all the different acquisitions that are going on out there right now in different areas, this is another opportunity to potentially reorg. But when do you do it? What's the right structure? How do you approach it? So Ben, to your point, right? Yeah, we got there, did initial integration, but we made slow changes, right? We made a couple little adjustments here. But as we got into 2022, we started thinking about shared responsibilities. What are the things that are shared across the organization? Because for us, with 3 different business lines now, there are things that transcend the three different lines. So where do you put it? Do you put it in one, or do you create a horizontal team that goes across? So what we did here is we actually created horizontal teams for certain activities that spanned all 3 business units, and then put the focus of the business units into the 3 business unit leaders. Now, there's pros and cons to this approach. And I wanted to use this article to talk about it a little bit, because the pros are you get more efficient shared resources across the organization. The challenge, in my opinion, is you also lose some of the insight and the ability to influence change in those horizontal groups from the business unit side, right? So I own the P&L, but I don't own most of the resources that contribute to the P&L. And so that creates a little bit of a challenge in those types of structures. So just think about when you're reorganizing your staff, think about, crossover, but also think about, what are the challenges from each of the little vertical areas when you have kind of these cross-functional teams? And I would imagine they exist in security as well.
Yeah, and I think I look at that as more, are you trying to implement almost a shared services model, right? In some instances. Right. And I think especially in larger organizations where you're doing acquisitions, so, you can think of very large multinational, but you require really agile subunits. It's a different business model for those subunits to operate in. But from a security perspective, one of the things that, when I was at Visa or, Nokia, one of the things I was always concerned with is, how do you make sure that you're implementing good security controls and process for all those smaller units you're acquiring, while not stifling their, agility? And so in order to do that, I think a shared services model works well, where you say, okay, we're going to manage this at a bit different level across the horizontal, but then we'll give individual responsibility at those business units to do specific tasks or functions that are more suited at that individual business level. So it's almost a hybrid approach, but I think it can work well depending upon, what the scale of the organization is.
Right. Next article, Toxic Leadership, the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse Know Them. Really good article for leaders. Like, these are the four things you should never, ever, ever do. If you want to keep your employees happy and you want to keep them there, otherwise they're going to go find a job elsewhere.
Well, it's that truism about people don't leave jobs, they leave leaders, right? So
yes.
this is if you see one of these four things, you're likely looking to run. So if you see this in a manager or somebody in the company that has a leadership role, figure out how to get it addressed quickly.
I think these are kind of no-brainers though too, right? Like, often we have to realize that some of these are masked as other, we'll say, other traits that are not ideal, and often they get brushed under the rug, or they're taken as a personality, or they're just, looked at from a business standpoint, and you're taking that business risk because you have other positives. But if you actually dive into some of these and look at the underlying problems with how these portray themselves and how they come out in other traits, and not just these root cause or root problems, you can also address those minor traits and potentially get ahead of it. But these are the no-brainer pieces of this, with a lot of subtle hints underlying that you do have to keep a handle on with inside your leadership, but also for yourself.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I think these are good things for even leaders to kind of look at and evaluate themselves against. Things like, so for example, some people could say I'm a little arrogant at times. I think I'm confident in certain decisions and capabilities I make. I'm not sure that I'm arrogant, but some people could say I might be a little arrogant, but I'm not dishonest. I'm one of the most forthright, open, transparent people. I just ask anybody on my team, I probably tell them too much information because I rather have that open, honest, transparent dialogue with my staff than lie or try to hide things from them. It's just not my style. Never has been. I'm also not a micromanager, so things like manipulation and a lot of those other things, it's not my leadership style at all. So I like I said, arrogance. Somebody might call me that every once in a while.
Knowing is half the battle, Matt. As long as you're aware of it, you can change.
Exactly right. Yes.
I mean, in that borderline, there are some of those traits that you have to ride that edge very, very carefully. And to be really good at some of the things you do need that confidence. You do need to be a good leader. You do need to have the ability to influence people, which can come across as manipulation. So I would say some of those traits have to ride the line and have a positive and negative connotation. You kind of have to figure out where you're at.
Exactly.
And
right.
I think that's actually a challenge in, when you think about people you've known before, because I think we've all know somebody who exhibits one of these traits in a negative way and keeps moving up the chain, but nothing ever gets done about it. We all question why. And I think that's, because they mentioned arrogance, sales, that it could typically, you could see that in somebody in sales. And I think that's very true, right? It can be a somewhat positive characteristic trait in some salespeople. I think a lot of people in security, they're arrogant because they're really good at what they do, right? And so you could see that as arrogance, as Matt said, but it's crossing that line, right? And I think we need to have that honesty in ourselves and with other leaders of the company to say, hey, we're having an issue here. We need to address that before it becomes a problem, right? And it gets out of hand.
Right, for sure. Which leads us into this next article, how to persuade your staff for change. Two approaches identified in this HBR article. I like both of them for very specific reasons. So what it talks about is a couple of the different techniques to implement a change within the organization. The first technique is what they call the foot in the door technique, which is, let's try to do a little small change on the way to a bigger change, right? Which works in certain organizations, right? We kind of make incremental change steps to implement something a little more major from a change perspective. And when you're in a technology company, this kind of approach works, right? Because you're thinking about an agile kind of environment, life cycle, things move, making small iterative changes to reach a big outcome usually makes a lot of sense as a technique. The second technique is called the slam the door in the face, I think is what it's called, door in the face technique, which is And I like this one because I think this is the one I have to use where I am today. You have to like make such a drastic change where everybody rejects it and then they accept the change you actually want to happen. Like, think about that.
Perceived
for a
as
second.
reasonable.
Yes,
you make something unreasonable
exactly right.
to then propose the reasonable change. I think we're all used to doing that with budgets.
Isn't that like what
Exactly
Putin's
right.
doing right now? Like, is that what?
Maybe, yeah. He's so unrealistic that he's looking for, some middle ground, in the next few weeks. But that approach is really interesting because you really push the envelope. You don't really have to go that far or want to go that far, but then you get them to buy into what you actually want them to do. I'm more the believer of the first one, but I guess you did bring up a good point. Budget's always one where you want the door in the face technique.
Yeah, look, if you haven't read the book, Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss, who is the lead, I think, FBI hostage negotiator, read that book. Like, his take is like, always go for more than you think you want, because at the end of the day, like, you're not trying to settle on something that's going to make, both people unhappy. And it's the psychology behind it. So, yeah, I really recommend that book. I enjoyed it thoroughly.
As a leader, that psychology stuff becomes more and more important. You have to be able to influence people. You really do have to understand the different personality traits and how to work with them, especially when you're talking about this. The change piece really was something that I think was hard for a lot of people that were in tech early on. You kind of get that old curmudgeon way of doing things they know. So you have to kind of figure out how to maintain those people that have that institutional knowledge and that really great skill set that provides huge benefits to the company, while also giving them a way in which to adapt and not end up in a cycle where you're stuck in something. And that is because of so many people that are, institutionally there for a while, that change becomes inevitably impossible. Those are two things that are hard to play out, but that's where the leadership comes in, and you use the psychology and the understanding of people, and doing that in an elegant way is what makes really good leaders happen.
Well, it aligns a little bit with that. Are you ready for the reorg article, right? Because I think ultimately, at the end of the day, like, how many times have you ever heard going into an org where you're new and it's like, that's not the way we do it here? Okay, so we're just going to keep continuing on with a broken method, right? Now, the challenge as a leader is to come in and say, okay, is it really broken? Like, what is the reasonable change we need to do that's going to get to the right place for the company and the end result? And how do you bring people along on that journey? How do you articulate a vision of where you're needing to go? Message that out appropriately, and then get buy-in that people will start going on that journey with you. Because I think the worst thing you can do is put the stake in the ground for change and you haven't got anybody's buy-in. Yeah, you're going to fail.
Yeah. Miserably. Yes. Last article, 3 ways to take control of your cybersecurity career in 2022. Couple practical advices. We've covered pieces of this before. It's kind of a succinct article. The first one really is around just practical experience versus formal training, right? We've talked a lot about training programs, certifications, not always a requirement or the best way to get your foot in the door. Practical experience. Getting that experience, though, can be challenging, right? It talks a little bit about apprenticeships and some other things that you need to do. And then it does talk about fellowships and boot camps. I don't know if I haven't seen much in the way of some of these boot camps and areas, but it talks about some of the challenges with the higher level, courses. That's why I don't recommend to people that want to get into the space to go out and buy one of these big like boot camp certification programs, because I don't know that they extract the value out of it at the end of the day.
Have you ever run across somebody you'd hired because they went to a boot camp, Matt? Like, I don't. Nope. I can't remember a time. Like, I don't even know if somebody who'd say, hey, yeah, I went to this boot camp and it was a great experience. Like, just, I'm sure there are some people it works for, but I haven't run across it. It hasn't professionally been something I've seen to be impactful. So I would much prefer that somebody goes and gets practical experience. And, people say, well, how do you get practical experiences, if you don't have any experience to start with? Well, figure out something that's an adjacency, right? I mean, it's what we look for product. How do we move product out towards an expanding set of skills? We look for an adjacency and we slowly move in that direction, usually, as opposed to that big bang approach. So look for something that's easier to break into, where you can get some experience that's adjacent to it. You can tell a story about how you have tangential experience that can move you into that role, and where you had successful things that happened in the role you had. And if you can lay out that story, I'm much more willing to take a risk on you.
Yeah, I mean, Jason shared great stories from the past of folks from the IT side of the house that had the adjacency skill set and had the interest in cybersecurity, ultimately moving into cybersecurity. So to your point, Ben, getting some practical experience could be help desk experience, could be, some IT service operational experience, something that gives you some of that foundational capabilities and experience in the IT adjacency space or something like that is a way to get in as you show interest and aptitude around cybersecurity, for example.
Yeah, and I would say, we typically, somebody who's somewhat in the industry, right? So I know people in my life who have, kids that are thinking about, cyber careers or things in the space. And, I always tell them, like, look, if they're interested, let me know, and I can reach out to people and see if there's things that they can do. And it may not always be in the cyberspace. It may be, especially if you're in that position, hey, I'm willing to do whatever. I'm willing to do a help desk role, as you said. I'm willing to do something in the IT side of the house, like just let me get my foot in the door, right? And then show success, like build that track record that you're successful in what you do. And I think ultimately you'll find the path.
I mean, I think that's one of the best pieces of advice that I try and divvy out when people are interested in getting into it, or they think the job's cool, is really providing them that shortcut track of things that have helped me in my career that are not typical. You can always go do training, certs, boot camps. Those are great. Honestly, if you spent some time learning operations, learning a niche space like ICS or OT, getting in on a help desk so you understand all the platforms and user troubles, and then really learn communication, business, and all the business lingo, like you do those things first, you're probably 90% more valuable once you pick up the small percentage of security things to any organization you go into, because those are the things that are missing.
Some PHP, some Python, some scripting, some coding. You never know where it might get you.
Well, I love Tyler's suggestion about ICS, right? Like somebody who actually has practical experience in OT or ICS, then trying to get some security chops add on to it to be able to go back and say, okay, well, yeah, I do understand some security, but I can actually tell you why you wouldn't want to do that in an OT environment. Super valuable, right? So look at for those opportunities because they exist.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of came out of that space spending, a good chunk of my early career in nuclear power, right? I mean, I was working nuclear power real-time plant systems and some of the challenges there. Did it translate 100%? No, but it was a good adjacency skill set because as OT became hot, I started to understand the foundational elements around safety concerns and plants and organizations and why you probably not want to go patch one of these devices or potentially take it down to patch it because there were other ramifications of these devices, right? And so, there are other areas like that, plant managers, for example, and others that have, if there is some crossover with IT in those environments, there is a really good solid foundation to potentially address some of the security concerns in those environments as well.
That's another point that you just made there, Matt, that has served me really well over the years is don't ever take for granted anything that you're learning. Wherever you're at, try and learn the most that you can because you never know how far down the road that information may become relevant or useful from a red team standpoint. Like learning about printers and how multifunction copiers were deployed in mass to organizations 15 years ago now plays a huge role into my red team. Like I know all the default codes, how they're managed, how they're set up and configured, what the kind of pipeline and sales process is. So if you're in a sales role, understanding the back-end sales CRM, all those little things that you learn along the way pay
dividends. Tyler lost his internet again. Darn it. But he makes a really good point. All that knowledge potentially can come back and help you later, for sure.
Yeah.
If Tyler comes back, Tyler, thank you for stepping in today for Jason. Ben, always a pleasure. Thank you, everyone, for watching and listening. We'll see you next week on Business Security Weekly.